Good evening. We are about to start our panel this evening. And I think to start off, I just want to thank our panelists for having joined us and for you, the audience, this evening. So I'll start off with a quick introduction of what we hope will be a very interesting panel on harnessing the power of finance for nature. And so I'll ask that we have your seats so that we can proceed with this session. So before we start, it's important to paint the African context. And I'll take very few minutes to paint this. I'll talk about Africa in terms of the opportunities. I know we've quite talked about some of the challenges which we're going to be speaking about even at this session. But I want to remind you all of Africa's opportunities when it comes to nature. Africa has 30% of the world's minerals. It contains about 65% of the world's arable land, and interestingly, 25% of the world's global biodiversity is actually in Africa. And so where's the opportunity? Reviving ecosystems, according to the United Nations Environment Programme, will contribute to about a third of the climate mitigation efforts required by 2030. Agroforestry alone will contribute to increased food security for about 1.3 billion people. And according to the UNEP again, for every $1 invested in nature restoration activities creates up to $30 in economic benefits. And finally, the Green Growth Platform found that for every $1 invested in marine protected areas in Senegal and Tanzania, generated over $5,000 in economic benefits or economic value. Isn't this a great return on investment? So this evening we are joined by an esteemed panel. We have SANDRA VILLARS from Oliver Wyman. We have JOSEP from Okavango Capital. We have RESHMA from Equity Group. We have KIRSTIN from African Wildlife Foundation. And we have Michael MUSGRAVE from the Africa Leadership University. And without further ado, I am going to get my seat and we're going to start. Great. So we are starting off with academia. We are starting off with academia. Michael, if you can speak to us about why you think financial sector governance is important in terms of focusing on nature and biodiversity conservation. And then, of course, bring in the very important aspect of academia.
Thanks, Dorothy. Yeah, as a first principle, those of you who are involved in the financial sector will know that you are widely invested in a wide range of businesses. And given that biodiversity is an input to our economy, and a very diverse input, you are, as a financial institution, therefore exposed to biodiversity loss or to the risks of biodiversity loss to each and every one of those different sectors that you're invested in. So that simple concept places the financial sector in a unique position in terms of governance. You need to be anticipating what the various frameworks and implications for risk and profitability are going to be in the future as we face this biodiversity crisis. I sincerely hope that we're not going to go through what we went through in the climate, the warnings about a climate crisis, where it took 10 to 15 years of saying, is it really going to happen, for industry, including the financial sector, to actually come on board and say, oh dear, it is happening, what do we do now? There is a biodiversity crisis, and there's universal agreement that the loss of biodiversity represents a very different challenge to climate change because of how dependent we are on biodiversity as an input into our economy. Simple things like soil fertility, pollination of our crops, supplies of water. These are all dependent on on biodiversity. And so what do we do in academia? How do we address this problem? We've been approached by several large African financial institutions to offer training. It's really early days in terms of how we address this in the financial sector. But what is clear is that the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the framework that has been set up by industry around disclosing and exploring the materiality of the exposure to biodiversity loss, is a really, really good starting point for how we might anticipate how these risks and losses are going to affect financial institutions. But this is a complex problem, and it's understandably often outside the expertise or the traditional engagements that financial institutions might be used to doing. And so as academia, we play a strong role in addressing that in a professional development training environment where we go through these complex ideas, we provide training, we simplify and distill these ideas into practical tools that can be implemented by the financial sector so that we anticipate some of the risk that's out there from biodiversity loss.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. And I think, Sandra, you have supported financial institutions quite a lot through the work that you have been doing with the African Natural Capital Alliance. And tell us, what is the role of finance in nature?
So, no, thanks for the question, Dorothy. I think, you know, the first answer I'll give is what we probably all knew was going to be the answer, which is, you know, the financial sector is a conduit of capital to the real economy, if you will. And so your banks, your investment companies, insurance that do risk management, and that the whole ecosystem of the financial sector is really allocating capital and a conduit of capital investment to the real economy. So if you were to take the balance sheets of banks and you were to look at the portfolios of investment companies and you were to peer under the hood, what you will see is what's going on in the economy and what's important to the economy. So when we think about where we need to move that to, it's very important that, that financial institutions are going along on that journey. And the African Natural Capital Alliance, ANCA, as many of you know, is working with financial institutions. There's a real focus on financial institutions to build capacity and to make sure that they know what they need to do, because and I think you made the point that financial institutions, this is not, you don't find a lot of PhDs in environmental science in financial institutions. You have people who understand finance, but this is all new to them. And so you may have you may have good intentions, even at the senior level, but there's a real lack of knowledge, and there's a skills gap, and there's a real knowledge gap that needs to be bridged. So it's important that there actually needs to be there needs to be a very intentional focus on upskilling people in the financial sector to understand some of the terminology. And so what we do, for example, in the piloting work we've been doing with FSD Africa on the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD, is actually take financial institutions through a process of identifying and understanding what their exposure is, understanding or being able to do a materiality assessment, and some of these more basic skills, getting them comfortable with the language, so that it's not just a high-level, kind of a high-level statement to say we would like to support nature and we want to invest in nature and we want to be part of this. It really becomes part of their business. So that embedding into the business processes, so in a bank, credit processes, identifying opportunities and pipeline, and really understanding how they might start to make trade-offs, because we have to, I mean, this is complex. It's a complex issue, and a lot of people in financial services have only just started to get their head around climate. So now starting to understand how nature is also important and is complex, and the idea that you could make an investment in, you know, a copper mine and be kind of, and you may be worried about, say, water pollution that happens, but then how do you weigh that against potentially the money that may come to the local communities to improve health, you know? So there's some of these things that really need to be quantified and that need to be understood in a very sort of rigorous way, which the financial sector, I think, needs to be brought along on that journey.
Thank you, thank you, Sandra. And Mike, I'll pick on you at some point. We had a conversation, and you told us a very interesting story about pollinators and the role of pollinators. So I'll pick on you, but I just want to draw from Michael your clarification on the role of academia and the need to simplify. Sandra, the role of financial institutions and their need to understand, the need for them to understand this particular topic so that, you know, real solutions can come to the table. I want to now move to Joseph. As Okavango Capital, what is your opinion on natural capital as an asset class? Is it a new asset class? Is it an old asset class? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities that you see from your own experience?
Yeah, thank you, Dorothy. I think in general, it's more a lens at which you look at an existing set of asset classes. Mm-hmm. And the main challenge with nature is around the way we think about it. We've historically thought about nature and protecting the planet in sort of from a moralistic perspective. You have to do it because it's good. Yeah, you know, Bobby the elephant will die if you don't do it. It's terrible if, you know, we let these things go away. We never use economics thinking, or historically didn't, right? It's now dawning on everyone how dependent we are on natural capital. Conversely, what ends up happening is this lack of systemic thinking about nature. It means that you think, well, let's plant a tree. A tree is a tree. Nature operates in very complex systems. And that means, you know, just like you do with humans. You have an aerospace engineer, and she may be very bright and do very nerdy things with a computer. You put 1,000 of them, and you have a rocket going to the moon. Right? And nature provides orders of magnitude more ecosystem services, which are literally services that provide value to the world economy when you have large connected ecosystems. The consequence of that lack of thinking means, first, you have very valuable ecosystems, particularly in Africa, that have no real economic, or let's say they have a lot of economic value, but they're mispriced because they have no cash flows attached to them. That means they're a big cost to governments. It's very unfair to ask a government leader in a developing nation to sacrifice building hospitals or sending the country's girls to school to protect a natural space that is not producing any income for the country. There is a challenge in having to make choices that are economically unfair, in that individuals that own or manage, are the stewards of the land, can choose whether to have wilderness and intact forest, high levels of biodiversity, which may or may not produce any income, or a maize field, which is producing income, right? And those choices are hard. Now, does that create an opportunity? Massive, right? You look at the dynamics that are putting pressure on natural capital today, in the continent particularly, right? You have massive growth in population with growth in demand for natural resource-related aspects. And this opportunity cost, if you will, of nature is driving people to deforest for energy. So they need fuel to cook. Then they farm. They don't farm very well. They don't choose the right crops. They don't use the right technologies. They don't manage their soil and water very well. And they obviously reduced biodiversity, then there's a massive post-harvest loss because there's no access to market, there's no access to processing power, to storage, to value, a pre-disrupted value chain. And then in addition to that, you have these large ecosystems that produce no income, right? The opportunity is massive to address those themes, right? So you invest in ways in which people can farm better. We don't need to farm more in Africa, we just need to farm better. The productivity yields are very low. You increase that. You reduce the post-harvest loss, which is around 50 to 54%, according to Deloitte. You're already increasing people's yields. You're improving their livelihoods. They don't have to keep on deforesting. And then you go to these large-scale ecosystems that are incredibly valuable, and the market is starting to react to. You can create layers of value that you stack on top, one on top of the other. You can start with things like forest carbon, which has been under a lot of scrutiny and criticism. We're big defenders on it. We're pioneers in the market. We've seen massive positive outcomes, both impact and finance-wise from them. You can add biodiversity payments. This is a very emerging sector. You can add a number of other services like nature-based tourism, etc. So those are key opportunities from an investment perspective. For us as an investment manager, a key challenge is that the thinking is not there. The institutions haven't done all their homework yet. Some have, like FSD and a couple others, but a lot of the large institutions are starting to think about nature. They're aware they have a challenge, they have an opportunity, they don't really know how to address it. So that's happening. It's going way too slowly, but we're in the process, right? It's a bit of a long road. The second part, and I'll finish there, is that there's a big need to deploy capital and scale. That investable opportunities are not necessarily that large yet. Some are, but generally they are sort of small or medium sized. So I guess admitting that I'm highly biased, there's a great opportunity in backing intermediaries who have access to a lot of opportunities at that scale.
Yeah. So hearing from you, it's the different lens within which you look at the nature discussion. You say there are great opportunities and that possibly institutions have not done their homework. RESHMA, have you done your homework as Equity Bank?
Look, I can't answer that with a yes or no, but I'll tell you one thing.
Yeah.
I think at Equity, our focus was very much on our whole vision, everything was lives and livelihood. And there's a big appreciation now that you can't focus on lives and livelihood without nature. So that penny has dropped. Have we done all our homework? No. Do we understand it all? No. But the key thing is there's a recognition at a very senior level that's now trickled down the organization that we need to do something about it. Now, when we look at our own strategy, our strategy is focused on how do we catalyze development in Africa. And how do we do that is through areas of agriculture and mining. Two sectors that are probably impacted the most and impacting the most when it comes to nature. So we have, because of that, we've spent a lot of time trying to understand our strategy and the effect of our strategy going forward. Some of the things, Joseph, that you talked about in terms of agriculture, productivity, all those aspects, post-production loss, are some of the things that we've been looking at. I spend a lot of time in mining companies, and the big thing I see there is the big areas of deforestation. And I spend a lot of time with them talking about decommissioning and what are they going to do post that, so that we can actually start, looking back and replacing the land to what it should be when it's at. So in terms of the homework that we've done, I think we've embedded these aspects into our risk management so that we can at least start to identify where the risks are and can start looking at how we help our clients. There's still a long way. We've done more on climate, as you've mentioned, and now bringing it into nature. We're now doing the TNFD pilot, which will help us enhance that even further and bring in the tools that we need in developing them. But we're also looking at the opportunity side. And as a financial institution, we focus a lot on risk, but where you can really drive change is through the opportunity side. And there we've been looking at aspects of how do we turn nature into an asset. So the big question right now, everybody is talking about carbon credits, and we're talking about carbon plus credits. We'll be talking to a number of people on how we get that. But beyond carbon credits, how else can we turn nature into an asset? And one of the biggest things right now is we don't know how to finance it, because you can't finance it with pure commercial funding. And so the next thing is, how do we bring in all the right parties to create a blended finance pool that can actually create the environment that it needed for funding? So I think those are our learnings, those are the things we've put in place, those are the things we want to put in place, but it's a journey and we've started, but I think there's a lot more we can bring in.
And it sounds like you're doing your homework, right? I just want to bring in the role of development organizations, the role of science, the role of research. When Anchor started off, it was highly based on the financial sector, and then suddenly there was the realization, just like Sandra, you said, you need to understand the science behind it, you need the research behind it, you need academia, you need law, because you need to understand the governance behind this. And so KIRSTIN, specifically for the African Wildlife Foundation, what particularly, how can development organizations, academia, work to effectively address the nature challenge?
So I think, I mean, I'm coming from completely the other side of it. So, you know, I work for African Wildlife Foundation. It's an African conservation organization. It's got 60 years of experience on the African continent, conserving biodiversity, species, nature. And I think just picking up on what RESHMA said, you know, the African Wildlife Foundation learned very early on that you can't conserve nature without looking at livelihoods. And so very early on started to develop that expertise to bring communities into the center of our landscape conservation programs. So I think what the African Wildlife Foundation would be saying now is, we've been conserving nature for a long time, we've been conserving biodiversity for a long time, we've learned a lot of things along the way. And I think what we're seeing now with what's happening in the financial sector is a massive upsurge of interest in how can we all work together to solve this challenge. And the conservation organisations like AWF that have a long track record on the continent can bring that expertise to the table and say, you know, we make lots of mistakes, yes, but we learn a lot. But overall, we're still here after 60 years, and that means that there's a level of success there. You know, been working with some of these challenges and risks for a really long period of time, albeit with different types of financing, yes, but we can bring that expertise to the table and bring our learnings about what actually works to deliver impact, positive impact for nature on the ground. So, you know, obviously we see a lot of conversations going on about frameworks, and that's really important. A massive upsurge in interest in the corporate sector and engaging in this space. So if you look at, you know, the climate COPs, the CBDs, you know, the level of engagement in the private sector is really changing, and that's really positive. But going back to what Joseph's saying, it's a process, and we know it's a process. So at AWF, we've been talking to some corporate sector parties, and they're telling us that we all want scale. So yes, we want scale to have that transformative impact that we all want to see. And we know that, you know, that's going to take time, but we can also see that, you know, there's a paradigm shift going on as well. So, you know, bringing the whole idea of climate, biodiversity and economic development together into a model for development and for growth at national level, at international level, is a little bit newer, I would say. And I'd just like to reference, you know, the ALU work on the wildlife economy. AWF's engaging on that, you know, trying to tap into what it means for nature to be have economic value and to be an asset for economic development. And there's quite a lot of thinking going on there. So there are lots of really positive things happening. Conservation organisations bring that expertise. We work with academia a lot. We work with the ALU a lot on this space. We can bring different stakeholders to the table so that we can try and move together so we can understand each other better and find those solutions that we all want.
And as we understand each other better, Mike, please tell us, just simplify for us, to the investors in the room, why is nature important? And specifically, if you could draw on the, the analogy of the pollinators.
Yeah, I use pollinators a lot as a very simple example of where the gaps are in terms of how we think about risk and nature. And so we all know that crops like tomatoes and cucumbers and oranges and almonds and all the stone fruits, peaches and plums, these are all pollinated by insects, okay? It's a very simple process. If any of you studied biology at high school, you would have learnt about, how it happens. But as financial institutions, I wonder whether, I've never seen an example of you actually taking into account that risk in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, that those pollinators might not provide that service anymore, or that it might decline. Okay, it's not going to disappear overnight, but you're exposed to the decline of pollination services the minute you invest in a farming or agricultural enterprise that depends on pollination, and yet you do nothing about valuing that risk or assessing that risk. And so, if we were to point that out to you as financial institutions, and you'd say, oh, well, that's a big gap in the market, maybe we should do that. You'd go to the farmer and you'd say, can you measure the pollinators every year? Are they increasing, decreasing, staying the same? And then you'd have some information, and you'd be able to assess the risk based on whether that pollination was going to happen every year reliably and to a sufficient degree. Great. But those pollinators are not machines. They come from somewhere. They breed. They need somewhere to lay their eggs. They need somewhere to hide from predators. They need somewhere to shelter from extreme weather. They need somewhere to overwinter. That place is called a habitat. It's like a factory for pollinators. So why doesn't that have value? Why don't we value that patch of land that just looks like bush as a factory for pollinators, which you depend on in order to get your loan paid back? So, these things are so simple really in that example, in the pollination example, that, anybody can understand that, and yet we're so used to taking this service for free that we just don't put it on the books. We don't put it on a balance sheet. We don't account for it whatsoever. And in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, that doesn't come for free anymore, or if it does, it's probably not for too much longer. So just a simple example there of how you need to be a bit more imaginative about what you value and how you could value biodiversity. It gets much more complex than that, I'm willing to admit that. But let's start with the simple stuff. We're not even doing that as financial institutions. We're not even putting value on the very simple inputs that biodiversity make in that pollination example.
And we've been threatened by the bell. And so I'm going to give the rest of the panel a minute each. When it comes to harnessing finance for nature, Sandra, what is the one thing that you would like to say to the investors in the room as the rest of the panel thinks through?
I think it's to learn, because as I said, I think it's an area where you sort of, first you stumble in blindly and then you realize that you actually need to know some things. And so I think learning and kind of networking and figuring out what's happening in the industry and sort of educating yourself, building skills around it is probably the most important thing.
RESHMA?
I think for me is look at it not in a linear way, but look at the ecosystem. The things that we talked about valuing, etc., if we can't bring them into the linear equation, once you start thinking about an ecosystem, you will have to think about it. And that's what I've found has helped me when I'm talking to really hardcore commercial people who don't see this, is taking that ecosystem approach and looking at it holistically.
Non-linear approach or linear approach?
Non-linear.
Non-linear.
Non-linear. It's the whole ecosystem. You've got to look at how the dots actually connect. And it might not be one-to-one, but if you look at the bigger ecosystem, you will start seeing the importance of nature, even if it's not as an accountant or as a financier. You look at it on a direct transaction, but you don't look at all the other things that might impact that transaction, and that's why ecosystem is extremely important.
Joseph, as an investment manager?
I think we have to stop wasting time. We have enough data to know that the majority of the economy depends on natural capital. We are out there celebrating debt for nature swaps in the order of $30 million when we should be doing hundreds of millions, if not billions, in every transaction. We need orders of magnitude more money flowing towards nature-related investments.
More money on the table, more money on the table. KIRSTIN.
Yeah, and I think I would probably say come and talk to us. We want to co-create things. I think we're in that phase at the moment where it's ripe for piloting things, it's ripe for trying things. And I think I would say let us not let the fear of the unknown, i.e. the worlds that we work in, stop us talking to each other to try and pilot things. Because I think, picking up on what Joseph said, we don't have time to wait for the magic bullet that might be there in 10 years' time. We want to, we need that financing conservation, and we need it before 10 years' time.
So there is no time, and welcome to piloting. Any questions? Do we have time for questions from the audience? We don't have time? Okay. So please give the panel a hand of applause. We were short of time, but thank you very much.